Last time we talked about international trade theories that explain why nations might want to trade and who should trade with whom. Now imagine that you are in charge of a country's economic policy. You have analyzed all of your options here and you have determined that your country needs to trade more, or maybe needs to trade less, or maybe you need to restrict imports but promote exports, or the other way around. The question then is, what are the tools at the disposal of a government that can be used to promote or restrict imports, exports, international trade? So what you as a government can do to regulate international trade. And so I would like to start this lecture with a quote by Thomas Macaulay, who exactly 200 years ago said the following: "Free trade, one of the greatest blessings which a government can confer on a people, is in almost every country unpopular." So 200 years ago, Mr. Macaulay was saying that most of the countries could greatly benefit from international trade, but in most of the cases, in most of the countries, free trade is unpopular. So the challenge for the government here is not only to find a way to regulate trade, but also to sell this policy to its people. Most likely you will determine that international trade is in your favor, but your people will not think that way. And so the challenge for you will not only be to find a way to promote international trade, but also to sell this idea to the people who elected you to the office. And so the challenge here is to do the right thing while facing the opposition of the people who may not understand that this is the right thing to do. So now, before we start, here are the reasonable questions that everybody should ask about international trade. So one, why would a government want to restrict or promote imports and exports? So why? We kind of talked about that in the past, in the previous lecture. So we talked about the benefits and risks of international trade, of job outsourcing, of imports, and hopefully now you know the answer to those questions. But then once you know the answer, how can a government restrict or promote imports and exports? And more importantly, what are the pros and cons of the different methods? So today I will give you the list of tools at a government's disposal, but you must understand that there are no magic bullets or magic pills and silver bullets. Every tool will do what it's supposed to do, but it always comes with a host of side effects, of unintended consequences, of costs and risks. So if you would like to use the tool, you will probably get what you wish for, but in a larger package with all kinds of downsides. So we will talk today about not only what you can do, but also what you should expect in the way of positives and negatives, in the way of intended and unintended consequences of each of those tools. So here are the tools that we will be talking about. So for the trade promotion, we will talk about subsidies, foreign trade zones, export finance and special governmental agencies. And for the trade restriction methods, we will talk about tariffs, quotas, embargoes, local content requirements, administrative delays, and currency controls. And so I'm going to start here with subsidies. So we will first talk about things that a government can do to promote trade. Most of the time people think about government restricting trade, imposing tariffs or quotas, but often government also needs to promote trade. The government often wants its businesses, companies, trade. So they want more, for example, exports. And so the question then becomes, what can a government do to promote imports or exports? Well, one of the ways would be to offer subsidies. So it would be, for example, subsidies to the companies that export, or maybe subsidies to the companies that import, depending on what you want. And again, it could be subsidies to your own companies or companies from your country, or the subsidies to the companies from other countries. For example, there could be all kinds of subsidized, for example, grants or other perks for the companies that wish to export. And in fact, most of the US states have a lot of programs designed to help companies, American companies, to export, right? And so in many cases it would be either financial help, or in some cases it would be some form of subsidized all kinds of perks, maybe access to cheaper financing, maybe some subsidies to build the facilities, to expand your production so that you can export and things like that. Now, obviously, the benefits of this approach would be that your company would be more competitive at the global arena. So if they receive a subsidy, they have it cheaper to make the product, and so obviously their product becomes more competitive in the global arena. And then also if you subsidize, for example, imports of whatever product you need, maybe there is a shortage of food, or maybe there is a shortage of some sort of valuable materials that your production needs, and you subsidize it, the prices will be obviously cheaper. But then the negatives would be that subsidies always encourage inefficiencies. So if you get something for free, it in a way, spoils you. So you relax too much, you stop innovating, you basically find this cozy place where you don't have to be mean and lean in order to be competitive. And also subsidies sound great in theory, but somebody has to pay for it. And so the government, doesn't have money of its own. So all the money a government has is that's what we paid, the taxpayers paid in Texas when we pay our taxes. And so in a way, it all sounds wonderful when we would like to subsidize a certain industry because we want them to trade more, to export more, or maybe to import more stuff into our country. But you should understand that it's not a benevolent government that took some of its own money and gave it to the companies that need to be subsidized, but the money was taken from our pocket and put in the pockets of some other companies. Sometimes it could be totally justified. Maybe it's really important for us to subsidize exports, or maybe it's very important for us to attract certain imports. And in that case, it might be totally justifiable to pay for that out of our pocket, but the calculations have to be made before the policy is imposed. And so you probably have heard a lot about some of the side effects of subsidies. In this case, not particularly in the context of imports, exports, although sometimes it could be. But many countries offer subsidies to farmers. Again, as we discussed in the previous lecture, many countries see agriculture as an industry that is of strategic importance, of strategic safety to the nation. And so we want to have our own food. In many cases, our own farmers may not be competitive on the global arena. Ukraine, Russia, Canada may be able to produce certain crops cheaper. And so the only way for your farmers to remain economically viable is when they receive subsidies from the governments. And so here I have a few snapshots of pictures of from the newspaper articles that talk about subsidies to the farmers. And in this case, it's actually subsidies to do nothing. So basically to cut the production so that the prices stay higher and so that the farmers can actually have higher profits. So, but again, it always comes at a cost and we have to pay for it, right? So now, when subsidies seem justified, we talked about that a little bit about in the context of international trade theories in general, but let me repeat some of the reasons or some of the circumstances when subsidies, despite of their cost and despite the fact that we, the consumers, the people, the voters, the citizens, pay for it. So here are some of the instances when subsidies might be justified. So one, if we are talking about a production and export perhaps, or import of a specific strategic product. So as we said, agriculture could be one of them. So we might want to subsidize the existence and maybe exports or imports of those products if they really are needed. And so in this case, if economically your industry is not competitive, but you want it to stay alive, maybe you want it to export, maybe you want it to remain viable and competitive in the global arena, you might want to provide some subsidies. But also when we are talking about a vital but narrow segment of certain products. So for example, you don't think about it as a product, but it very much is a product. For example, music or movies. Looking at countries like Ukraine or the Czech Republic. So they believe, and in fact I can attest to that, so the events in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, Russian aggression in Ukraine shows that language was a very big factor in this whole mess. And so it is in Ukraine's interests to promote cultural products like music or like movies in Ukrainian. Or again, same is done, for example, in France. So French language is heavily, or French language products, books, movies, music are heavily promoted and subsidized. Or, for example, French music in Canada, in Quebec, again, lots of subsidies for that kind of programs and products. Or Poland, for example, same thing. So, but the challenge here is that these are relatively small audiences. So obviously when you make a movie in English, potentially you have an audience of 1 billion plus people. Russian, again, you probably would have close to 200 million, maybe 300 million people who potentially can consume this product. But when it comes to, for example, movies or music or books in Ukrainian or Czech or Polish, the audience is too small. And so even quality products cannot be competitive just because the consumer base is so much smaller. And so many countries feel that in this case, they have to subsidize the production and export of this product. And again, so for example, Russians believe that Russian language is again of strategic importance to them, and they very heavily subsidized Russian products. And so here it could be both the content just because it's in Russian, but also the kind of content they want to promote. And so there are a lot of governmental programs and grants for movie studios, for example, to make movies in Russian language of the content and with the message that the government want. So right or wrong, we can talk about it all day long, but many nations feel that that's important and needs to be subsidized. For English language, obviously, English is under no threat, and so there is no need to subsidize Hollywood, and so they can make movies on their own expense and do just fine. The audience is so large that they can still make a lot of profits on those products. Now, another option or another product would be export financing. And so let's take a look here. So similar to subsidies, but in a specific form of cheap financing, basically cheap credit, free money. So again, many states in the United States, many countries in Europe, in other countries as well, have programs where companies can borrow money at very low interest rates, or maybe even sometimes interest-free, if the money were to be used for exporting, for example. So, for example, in the United States in 2014, a bill was passed called Agricultural Act of 2014 that authorized a number of programs to promote farm exports. And so that bill included, in addition to all of the other perks that it included, it also included cheap financing for exporting agricultural goods. So if you're a farmer and you would like to export your grains or whatever you make, you can apply for very cheap credits, loans from the government, and use that money to develop your production so that you can export your products. The pros and cons are essentially the same as with governmental subsidies. So it can make your, in this case, for example, agricultural industry more competitive. It can give them more resources for innovation and expansion. It could be totally justified in a short run. But again, it may encourage inefficiencies. Why innovate? Why work hard when you receive subsidies from the government and you can still stay competitive? It may also encourage unjustified risks. So if you can get literally free money or very cheap money to take a risk and maybe invest into a new production facility, if it goes bust, the government loses. You become, you go bankrupt, but the government never gets the money back. So when credit is expensive, you think very carefully before you borrow money. But when credit is cheap, people may take risks and borrow money when such risks are unjustified. And then again, obviously, the money doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from our pockets, from the taxpayers' pockets. And so it can be not only expensive, but also essentially I am paying for somebody's dream to export. And so it's important to keep in mind that there is a cost, a real cost, and the question is, would it be really justified? Is it really a good investment, or maybe it's not? And then in the long term, yes, all those inefficiencies, all those risks can create an effect where you, like a vegetable in a greenhouse, while you have the shield around you, you do just fine. But once that shield is removed, once you have to compete in the wild, all of a sudden you realize you are not viable, you are not competitive, right? An interesting method or an interesting policy is foreign trade zones. So people usually don't know much about those, although they are very, very common in pretty much all countries. So let me give you an example of what those are so that you can understand first what I'm talking about, and then we will talk about the pros and cons. So for example, here on the picture, you see a gigantic territory, 262 square miles. It's a free trade economic zone in the Philippines. And so it was created after a military base, a U.S. military base that was stationed in that region, was closed down. So for several decades, the American military base was near that town. An entire town, or most of the town, worked essentially around that military base. Laundry, food, services, all kinds of things that need to be construction, maintenance of facilities, transportation. So there were thousands and thousands of jobs servicing that military base. When the Americans withdrew, all of a sudden, all of those people, tens of thousands of people, jobs were lost. And all of a sudden, the region became depressed, economically depressed. And so the government had to do something about it. So they were looking for ways to stimulate production, to stimulate economy in that region. And so they created this free trade zone, free economic zone, which offered all kinds of perks to the companies that are willing to allocate to those zones. Essentially, tax holidays, no import tariffs, so all kinds of economic benefits and perks that make this specific small area very attractive for business. And so all kinds of companies came there for lower taxes, for lower regulation, for no import tariffs, export tariffs, and other regulations. And so obviously those companies coming into the region created jobs for the locals who were without jobs. But something like that is extremely common also in other countries. Like, for example, in the United States, there are dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of free economic zones in different states. So, for example, often when a foreign company is looking where to build an production facility, like, for example, Japanese automakers in their time were notorious for sort of shopping around. So they would say, okay, Toyota wants to build a large factory somewhere, and they would like, where should we build that factory? Maybe in North Carolina, or maybe in South Carolina, or maybe in Nevada. And so the states start competing for that business, knowing that it would be thousands of jobs created in that region. And so they often would offer some local grants, but in many cases also set up a separate free economic zone that offers all kinds of other perks, as I said, for example, lower taxes, maybe some other additional benefits from the state. For example, here in Greensboro, North Carolina, a couple of years ago, Boomsonic, it's a small jet airplane maker, announced that they want to make a production facility, build a production facility here in the Triad area. And so the state was so interested in them coming here that they gave them all kinds of benefits. So there was a few $1 million grant, but there were also some other perks that attracted them to this specific location. Likewise, Toyota is building here in Greensboro what they call gigafactory for making electric batteries. Again, expected, I believe, 2,000 jobs, if I remember correctly. And so again, a lot of concessions from the state to attract them here. And other states also were bidding for the same factory, so trying to attract them to their own location. And so that's how you often end up with a foreign company building, or maybe sometimes even a domestic company. So Amazon did the same thing when they were shopping a few years ago for opening there. I think it was the third headquarter. And so they were sort of, should it be Maryland? Should it be DC? Should it be New York, I think? And they looked at several locations. Eventually, they chose one near DC. I think it was in Maryland, actually. But again, due to all kinds of concessions that the state gave them, and so special economic conditions for that small area. So in many cases, as I said, it would be also like duty-free imports of parts to that location that normally would be taxed, all kinds of other special perks. Now, these are all very good ideas. So the logic here is that, we make a small payment in a form of tax credits, or maybe even grants, or maybe some special economic reduced regulations in the area. But we get a lot of jobs, a lot of taxes coming from the profits, from the corporate income. And so they look at it, states often look at it as an investment, so that we pay now and get those benefits back later manyfold. But what you should understand is that in many cases, and yes, that's all well taken. Yes, it does create employment and does lead to cheaper goods for domestic markets. And in many cases, it doesn't even require money out of our pockets per se. So it would be simply a tax holiday, for example, in which case the logic is, if we give them the tax holiday, they will come here, and at the very least, there will be jobs. There will be maybe personal income taxes, even if the company itself doesn't pay any taxes. So we still get something, and it's better to get something than nothing. But in many cases, the concern is that it's a zero-sum game. So if a company wants to open a major facility in the United States, they will. And so if the states sort of colluded and agreed, all 50 states, that we are not going to offer any concessions to anyone asking for those concessions, the company would still build the facility and still will probably, operate in the United States. But now here you basically, they make the states, the taxpayers, to pay for this development. And so at the very least, the losses are the loss of tax revenue in the long run. But then again, some may say, well, what if without the concessions, without the subsidies, or in this case, special economic regulations, reduced regulations, what if they were not viable, and what they, would never take off? So essentially, in a way, the logic here is it's like support of nascent industries, so maybe it's justified. Well, again, that concern is well taken, and so the point here is that you need to calculate take all of those factors into account when you do your calculations. And then obviously there may be challenges here. You benefit one specific small region where you set up the free economic zone or foreign trade zone, but then the companies outside the free trade zone become less competitive. And so you may subsidize, for example, companies in this specific area in the Philippines. But what happens to the companies outside the town? Can some of them go out of business because they now cannot compete with the companies located in the free trade zone because they pay less in taxes or import tariffs or whatever other concessions they have? So what can happen here is that by supporting one interest group, you disadvantage the other interest groups. And so as a result, you can create jobs here at the expense of losing jobs there. In many cases, also, the concern is increased pollution. So almost always, or often, not always, but often, the reduced economic regulation also means reduced regulation on pollution. And so as a result, in many cases, the area could be literally exploited, could be polluted. And so, yes, economic development could be happening, but at what cost? And so are you willing to risk, an increase in cancer rates by whatever percent so that an additional 1,000 jobs are created? So very difficult. From my own experience in Ukraine in the 90s, when the economy was doing not very well, free trade economic zones or free economic zones or free trade zones were extremely popular. And in some cases, it was pure corruption. So, for example, the town where I grew up, so not too far from that town, we have red granite quarries. So basically, red granite is being mined, and in fact, if I'm not mistaken, that's exactly the red granite that was used to build or to pave the Red Square in Moscow. So it's not really red; it's kind of orangish, kind of brownish type of granite, but it does look red. And so in the 90s, there was this whole movement with these free trade zones. And the idea was, let's set up a free trade zone around this quarry where this very rare, very expensive granite is being mined. And so they did. But essentially what happened was that that area would have been doing just fine economically without any special regulations. In that case, no taxes, no import tariffs, no royalties, you just extract it. But what happened in reality is that a very profitable mine was given to some corrupt friends of the politicians or friends of corrupt politicians, probably for a kickback. And so essentially it was all stolen from the people. So technically I should have had a piece of that. So that's in the region where I lived, and technically I should have been receiving a percentage of royalties because, the land and the soil and what's in it belongs to the people. But here, under the banner of economic freedom and economic stimulation, they essentially just gave it to some corrupt individuals who started selling it for huge profits, gigantic profits, without sharing those profits with us. So there was no need for that, and it was just simply a steal. It was simply a corrupt act. Another possible strategy could be special governmental agencies. So this one is perhaps the least controversial. So that's when the government sets up offices or agencies that help companies export or import. So an example could be JETRO, Japan Export Trade Organization. So it's a governmental agency in Japan whose job it is to help Japanese companies export. And so they have offices all around the world. You see the map here, so they have literally dozens and dozens of those offices. And they do things like if a company from Japan wants to export, for example, to the United States or to Africa. So these local offices of JETRO would help you with regulations, will explain what needs to be done, paperwork, tariffs, translations, all kinds of work with documents. They can connect you with the local businesses. They can find you local partners. They can organize exhibitions of your products. They can help you participate in whatever exhibitions are organized in that region so that you can be one of those fair expos and stuff like that participants. So they basically are sort of like an educator slash coach slash mentor slash guide for you as you are seeking to expand into new markets. And so obviously sometimes you need that sort of help. And so obviously here it is essentially like a practical university of sorts, or consultant or advisor. And so it's usually not that expensive, and so usually they are least sort of controversial for that reason. Although again, they're not cheap either, so I'm guessing that it's probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars per year for each of the offices. And so when you add that up, that could be still quite a lot of money. And so the question becomes, who should pay for that? And then you should be very careful calculating the return on investment. Maybe some offices do not generate as much trade as you expect them, so maybe they're not doing the job. So there may be still some sort of controversies here. Notice here the map, and we will be going to that again and again in some other lectures. So this is a map from JETRO's website, and this is the Asian view of the world. So if you are from the Americas or from Europe, you are used to seeing the Americas on the left and then Asia on the right? And here it's a mirror, it's a different view. And so the reason for that is it's a perfectly accurate view. So if you're in Asia or Australia for that matter, it's more convenient for you to put you in the center. And so this way you see basically the whole world around you, so much more convenient to work with. Whereas in North America and Europe, we tend to reverse the map and sort of put our part of the world in the middle, or European view, I guess it would be in the middle, whereas you kind of see the rest of the world around you. So that's just something, that is not wrong. It's just a culturally different way to do things. So, all right. Now, let's take a look at a question that is likely to appear on the exam, and let's see if you would be able to answer it. Hopefully you've been listening to me and you know the answer. So, the following is not true about foreign trade zones. They are often set up to stimulate employment in economically depressed regions. True or false? Well, it is true, so that's not the correct answer then. They are used to promote international trade. Yes, they are, so it's not the correct answer. There are over a dozen foreign trade zones in the United States. Yes, that's very true. They are often called industrial parks, special economic zones, and other names. Very true as well. Foreign trade zones are used as port of entry for imports and exports, but not as manufacturing regions where foreign companies get preferential treatment. This is not true. So both of those are correct. So this answer is not entirely correct, and that makes it correct for this question. So sorry for the double negatives here. Now let's take a look at what a government can do to restrict trade. And so we talked about some of those things in the previous lecture. So first that comes to mind obviously is tariffs, import tariffs, the first instrument that many governments go to when they would like to restrict imports. And most of the time when a government intervenes with international trade, it would be to restrict imports. And so the easiest method to restrict imports would be to impose a tax, which import tariffs are, essentially a tax on the product. Now, there are several misconceptions here when people talk about import tariffs. So they think that it's the import tariff on the seller. For example, in the United States, when we talk about import tariffs, for example, on Chinese goods, and again, we talked a lot about that in the previous lectures. So I showed you a video where Donald Trump was saying that he would impose an import tariff of 25% on Chinese goods. So he would tax Chinese more for selling their products in the United States. But the truth is, it's not how it works. So any tax that you add to the cost of the product is added to the price. And who pays the price? The consumer. So in a way, it's not something that the foreigners will pay you. It's something that the consumers will eventually pay. I guess in a way you get that payment from the exporters first, so from the manufacturer or from the importer, so the company that moves the product into your country, and so they pay you every time the units of products cross the border. So for every unit they pay whatever the price, whatever the tax is, let's say 25% import tariff. So if they import, let's say, I don't know, batteries, and each of them costs $100, they pay extra $25 to move it into the United States. But then obviously that price is not subtracted from the total price, but rather added. And so when I come and buy the product, instead of paying $100 that it should have been, now I pay $125. Just like in the United States, when you shop, when you look at the bill, at the receipt, you would see that, let's say, the product itself was $9.99, but then there was a sales tax of, let's say, 8 point something percent, right? And so your total price could be $11 or $10.87. And so in this case, yes, the tax is imposed on the seller, but in the end, it's added to the bill and you pay it. So you have to be very careful about that, because it sounds like you extract money from the seller, but in reality, you extract money from the buyer. And so in reality, you are taxing the buyer. So essentially, you are increasing sales tax in a way. You can take that money that you receive from the seller and then maybe move it into a special, I don't know, like add it to the, to the consumers or maybe sellers. But in that case, it just doesn't make sense, because you collect it and pay it back, so it wouldn't be a tax. So the only way it works if you keep the money as a government. And so, but then the sellers would basically, add that to the price. So in a way, you as a buyer pay that tax. So that's very important. And so last time we talked with you about the cases when over the years there have been import tariffs on, for example, steel, imposed by Bill Clinton, George Bush Sr., and Trump, on washing machines, on tires, and things like that. And we talked about the possible unintended consequences. So the intended consequences of import tariffs are protecting your domestic companies so that they are more competitive against the foreign competition, maybe generate income for the government, basically tax revenue, but in the long run it can reduce the competitiveness of your companies, because if they have to, if they do not pay the extra tax but foreigners do, all of a sudden your product becomes this much cheaper and this much more competitive. So, but then again, it also raises prices for the consumers. And as we discussed last time, and I have here a snapshot of an article that did some of that analysis. So it analyzed and determined that the 2009 tire tariffs imposed on the Chinese tires cost U.S. consumers $926,000, so almost $1 million per job saved. So they saved at that time about 1,200 jobs, which is good, but at the same time it was extra tax on the consumers at a staggering expense. So it was like 10 times as much as the job itself would have paid, if not more. And at the same time, 3.2 thousand jobs were lost in retail. So for every job saved in tire manufacturing, there were 3 point something jobs lost in retail, or 3 roughly jobs per one job saved in manufacturing were lost in retail. And then again at an extremely high cost. So it would have been literally cheaper just to give that money to the people who would be losing their jobs than to try to extract them from all of the consumers, because that was a much more expensive proposition. So here is another story related to import tariffs that shows how complicated this whole thing can be. So let me tell you this story and kind of step by step so you know what happened. So during the Clinton era, there was all this talk about how the steel from Japan kills jobs in the United States, how cheaper and often of higher quality Japanese steel essentially kills jobs in the United States in steel industry. And so the idea was that let's impose an import tariff on Japanese steel. And so the first attempt, when they tried to do it, they faced an unexpected opposition. And so that opposition came from a very powerful United Auto Workers Union, so basically people who make cars. So while the United Steelworkers were petitioning for tariffs on foreign-made steel, the United States producers of cars were petitioning against the tariff. And they were saying, are you crazy? If you impose the import tariffs on steel, the cars will become more expensive. And if the cars become more expensive, we will not be able to sell as many of them. And as a result, we will start losing jobs in our industry. And so essentially, you will be saving jobs in the steel industry at the expense of the jobs in the automotive industry. And so initially, it actually did work. And so initially, the tariffs were not passed. But then eventually, as I said, at least on 3 occasions, the United States imposed import tariffs on steel. And the consequences were not as good as expected. They were good for the steel industry, but not good for the rest of the country. And essentially, we all paid in money about $1 million per job also, and in other jobs lost, so that the steel workers in Minnesota, for example, can have their jobs. So the truth is that import tariffs, they tend to benefit certain groups at the expense of other groups. So obviously they benefit specific interest groups, but everybody else pays for it in higher prices and often at a loss of jobs. For example, when you help farmers, in many cases that means that all of the consumers pay more to help farmers. If you support the textile industry, it often means that everybody else will have to pay for higher prices on clothing because of the import tariffs. And so again, here you have to decide for yourself, is the price worth the benefits? And often it's not. Now here is a question for you. Let's see if you've been listening to me. So which of the following import tariffs do not do? Do they raise prices in consumer markets, domestic markets? Yes, import tariffs make prices higher. Raise consumer prices in foreign markets. That's probably the correct answer. So if you cut supply or distribution to your country, products will probably stay in their country, and increased supply reduces the price. Although again, they may go out of business, and in this case, in the long run, it actually may increase increase consumer prices in foreign markets. But so in the short run, it probably will lower prices in the foreign markets. Now, let me tell you one more story here, and this one goes to a bridge in, or between rather, Minnesota and Wisconsin. So the bridge was built using a government grant, federal government grant, and so because it connects 2 states, so it connects Duluth, Minnesota, and Superior in Wisconsin. So because it was connecting 2 states, it was a federal grant, and there was a bi-state sort of committee that was overseeing the construction of this bridge. And at some point, the question became, how are we going, or what kind of steel are we going to buy to build the bridge? And so the Minnesotans, being a state that has a lot of steel mills, they said, well, what here to discuss? We are going to use American Minnesota-made steel to promote jobs, to stimulate job growth in our state. Very logical. Now, Wisconsin, they don't have steel mills, and so they were not as keen on paying more money for steel from the United States if a better alternative is available elsewhere. And so they started shopping around, and they quickly found out that they can buy cheaper steel of better quality from Japan. And so they had this tug of war back and forth. Minnesotans were saying that we're going to be patriots and we're going to buy local steel. And Wisconsin was saying the budget is tight, so we don't have enough federal money to build the bridge. We have to supplement it with the money from our own state budget. And so we don't want to take money from our hardworking Wisconsians. And so if we can buy the product cheaper somewhere else. And so after arguing back and forth, what they decided to do, they decided to build the bridge half and half from Japanese and American steel. And so now when you cross the bridge, you actually can hear the difference in the noise on the Minnesota side versus Wisconsin side. So apparently the Wisconsin side that was built with American steel is nice now, decades later, is nice and sturdy and just, is fine. But the Minnesota side, because it was built from steel of somewhat lower quality, now you can hear a rattling sound when you drive on the Minnesota side of the bridge. So the quality of steel started to show the difference in quality, right? And so who was right and who was wrong here? I don't know. I mean, if you are a governor of Minnesota and you decide to shop for steel elsewhere, your voters will not understand, will not support that. So they will say we have to support local manufacturers. If you have a tight budget like Wisconsin and your voters are not in that industry that you're trying to support, so why should you pay for Minnesota steel when you can buy a cheaper product in Japan and save hardworking Wisconsians some money? So difficult question here, right? So here is an example of how and when import tariffs are used unwisely. So for example, in the 90s, Ukraine imposed import tariffs and quotas on cell phones. So you could not bring with you more than 2 phones when you were entering Ukraine. And if you wanted to bring phones for the purpose of resale, basically if you wanted to import phones to sell them in Ukraine, you had to pay an import tariff. And that makes no sense because in Ukraine at that time, and I'm not sure probably still to this day, Ukraine does not make cell phones. And so it was not even a protection. It was simply a tax on consumers, on people who buy smartphones. And it's not necessarily on the rich people because at that time everybody already had smartphones. So it was essentially just extra sales tax. And yeah, maybe sometimes it's justified, but again, in this case, it's not even protectionism of jobs. It was simply extra tax. And so if you believe in taxes, I guess, that's a way to get extra money. But in a way, it was import tariffs misplaced. Not to mention that probably it should have been applied at the point of sale as opposed to at the import point, right? So now, again, last time we did go through this, and so I just want to repeat some of the numbers from the previous time. So when you are trying to impose import tariffs, you always have to do calculations. First, how many jobs will be saved? How many people are working in that industry and how many of those jobs might be lost if you do not protect the industry. But at what total cost to consumers and taxpayers? How much, what would be the cost per job saved? Let's say you will save 1,000 jobs, but how much will that cost in the extra taxes and other unintended consequences? And so what will be the overall net gain and net loss? And so here I just provide the links to the articles. We discussed them in the past. But as I said, with the Chinese tires, they saved about 1,200 jobs, but the expense of about $1 million per job saved, and also 3.7, not 3.2, 3.7 jobs lost in retail. So all of a sudden, it's a substantial loss in other industries. So same thing with the steel tariffs. So estimated cost of one job saved was about 900,000, again close to $1 million. And washing machines, again, import tariffs imposed in this case by the Trump administration. The calculations showed that the savings were at about the cost of $815,000 per job. And so you can look at some of the calculations from that study. And so here they basically, that's all of the calculation that went into those studies. Again, they did all kinds of analysis by industry, and so found that overall the losses were quite staggering. So now, if you took this course as an economic course, there would be